Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
Now, a word about our author. In Unmaking War, Remaking Men, Kathleen Berry explores soldiers' experiences through a politics of empathy. By revealing how men's lives are made expendable for combat, she shows how military training drives them to kill without thinking and without remorse, only to suffer both trauma and loss of their own souls. She turns to her politics of empathy to shed new light on the experiences of those who are invaded and occupied, and shows how resistance rises among them. Please join me in welcoming the book passage, Kathleen Berry.
Well, thank you for coming out in the rain. I didn't even know it was raining until I got in the car and started driving down 101. I came down from Santa Rosa. Can you all hear me okay? Against the talk in the bookstore?
We'll try to turn it up a notch.
Okay. I'm going to focus on the subtitle of my book today. The title, Unmaking War, Remaking Men, casts a wide net from male socialization and obviously then female socialization that wars rely on, that militaries rely on, to state policies, to, are you having trouble hearing? Would you like to move up a little bit?
Yeah.
Besides, that brings us all in a little closer. Makes me feel less removed. Okay, so the book casts a very wide net. I'm a sociologist and I focus on interaction, but I also focus on state and global structures that affect interaction. Well, enough of that kind of language. I want to focus today on the subtitle of the book, How Empathy Can Reshape Our Politics, Our Soldiers, and Ourselves. The book has had very good reviews. The one complaint that some people make is Kathleen Berry seems to think that empathy can actually end wars. That's a little bit overly optimistic. And you have to be overly optimistic. I mean, look at what we're up against. You were up against a White House and a Congress and the entirety of Washington, D.C. that really cares less about human lives. Our own soldiers, those of Afghans, those of Iraqis, those of the next country that we invade in this ongoing war. And one of the strategies that I think that we all need to be focused on, whether we're just doing individual things on our own, or we're actually part of some larger movement, is that we need to start defining the future and what we want the future to look like. And not just kind of scrapping away saying, please stop doing this, and then hope that they won't do the next thing. And so I think that's one of the things that we as feminists have always been engaged in, is getting a handle on what the future could look like, what another future, a different kind of world, could look like. I learned many years ago that even in working on my own individual life or with people who are I'm doing workshops with and doing programs with, or my students at the university, that if I ask them or ask myself to posit what do I want down the road, 10 years, well, I don't go much further than that anymore. I used to go up to 20 years, but now, it's good, 10 years is a good range. But at any rate, somewhere down the road, what is it that I want to see my life like? What is it that you students want to be doing with yourselves? I would ask them. And then start making the plans to get there. Because you have something in mind. You have an ideal. So yes, idealistic. It's an idealistic book. A friend of mine, as I was writing the book, a feminist at Georgia Tech, said to me, so what's the title? And I said, Unmaking War, Remaking Men. And she goes, well, that's optimistic. I thought, yes, it gets the point across. So, to empathy and how it can reshape our politics, our soldiers, and ourselves. I want to read from the opening of the book, just if you'll bear with me for just a moment. The ocean was particularly rough that day. A rescue helicopter hovered at the far end of the beach, where the attention of a random array of people was focused on the base of a cliff. 4 rescuers were carrying a black zipped body bag up the road. The victims' families were being led away by the State Highway Patrol. A collective grief hung over the beach that was absent of its usual playfulness. The beach-goers had just seen a father dive into the water, rescue his drowning son by hurling him over the fierce pull of waves to safety, only to be caught himself by the next stronger wave. In one swoop, the wave sucked him up, crashed him to the ocean floor before sending him out to sea, where the rescuers in the helicopter found him. It was over, but the people at the beach that day could not go back to their activities as if nothing had happened. One woman, her cheeks puffy and red, told me the details through her sobs, tears mounting with each sentence. Her husband and children sat behind her in mute sadness. No, she did not know the man who drowned, nor his family. Soon she and others began to pick up their things. This was not a beach day. What did it mean to those people who watched the boy fighting for his life, saw his father rescue him, then saw that man die? They were strangers whose lives were altered, whose tears and sadness were immediate. Shaken, I was drawn into their implicit unity, a force that seemed to hold this very random array of people together. What produced this palpable, shared grief that seemed to unite people who did not know each other, who did not speak with each other? I'm calling it shared human consciousness. When we as human beings see life threatened or slipping away, especially in an untimely fashion, we are united by a force of consciousness in which neither race nor gender, ethnicity nor nationality matter. We act instantaneously. Either we try to save the life at risk, like those standing on the beach, strangers to the victim. We strain as if we're willing the person's victory over the odds. Many of us have had this experience where we've seen somebody whose life is in danger, whether they're in a hospital bed and fighting to live, or you come upon an accident on a highway, or in this case, the drowning that I encountered on the beach up in Bodega Bay that day. And even if I wouldn't have had any sense that going in the water, I would have been able to get that man and bring him in. The waves were really fierce that day. But all of us were kind of, it was this kind of motion, there was something in our very being. This isn't just in the head, right? Something in our very being that was willing this man to save. One of the things that I like to watch every year, and it's about the only time I watch CNN, is the CNN Hero Awards. Because there you find those same people who do something totally extraordinary. I tell the story of Leslie Autry in this book, who saw a man go into an epileptic seizure on the subway in New York City, and he fell down into the tracks as a train was coming on. And this man had the presence of mind to be able to look at the train coming on, judge the distance between the bottom of the train and the depth between the tracks, jumped in, dragged the guy into the center between the tracks, covered his body with him, and they made it by just a few inches. The rest of the people on the platform, you know that they were just, he had his two little daughters there, there was he was African American, his African American woman standing by. He put their hands in her hands and just took off. Trust, connection, human consciousness. These stories really show us, I think, three things. That first of all, the human urge is to save and protect human life. Human urge is not to kill. Secondly, that human interconnection is what makes us people and what makes us human. It's pretty hard to think about a humanity without any other human beings around. And third, these are the sources of empathy that I'm going to talk about for a few minutes. I actually have always used empathy in doing interviews and research for books that I've written. My first book was called Female Sexual Slavery, and it was in 1979, and it started this movement on trafficking in human beings. And when I interviewed women in prostitution, that's what I had to do. I had no experience similar to that to be able to identify with. So the only way I could get to what their experience was to reconstruct the experience and put myself in their position. So I'm watching the 2006 Israeli bombing of Lebanon, and I'm hearing on the news the report of the loss of innocent lives in Lebanon every day. Now, we don't use that term in the American media to report when Americans are killing people in war. We call it collateral damage or just people being killed. But we don't say loss of innocent lives. That evokes something. But it really evoked a problem in me. It made me very agitated. I was perfectly set to spend a very relaxing, quiet summer recovering from an illness. And I'm watching this news every day, and I'm getting more and more agitated about this loss of innocent lives. Well, yes, because it was civilians being killed, but there was something wrong with the term, and I never noticed it before. Like many of us, I've used the term all my life. I never noticed it before. And it finally dawned on me. When you say that innocent lives should not be killed in war, you have created a category, we have created a category of people who should not be killed. As soon as we have a category of people who should not be killed, we automatically have a category of people who can be killed. And I thought, uh-oh, I got a problem here. This is not going to go away for me easily. I had no intention of writing a book on masculinity and war. In fact, I have 2 books that had to be shelved that were in various states of disarray and progress that had to be shelved when this question got under my lid and I couldn't shake it off. And so I just started writing about it. As I do with books that I really don't plan to write, I was going to write an article. And as it happened with this article, it became much more than I could. The issues were much larger and bigger. And at some point I said to myself, oh my God, now I'm going to have to find out what happens to soldiers in combat. Something that I, like most Americans, like most of our society that doesn't go to combat, are able to put aside. Because they go and they do it for us, and then our president says that they have sacrificed themselves for us and we're all fine. We've called them heroes, we tell them they made a sacrifice, and we don't have to know about it. How do you get to being a woman who's been teaching all her life and being a feminist and going around the world doing feminist stuff, and having to think about what's actually going on in combat. What I realized in the first interview I did was, and I didn't do this intentionally. I mean, it wasn't in part of my plan to go out and be empathetic in order to find out and understand what was going on. My plan was to go and interview this veteran who was interested in talking to me, willing to talk to me about his experiences in combat. And what I found was that I was putting myself, he was telling me, you know, he had been a drill sergeant after he had come out of combat, and then he tells me about what it's like to go into combat. And I'm following this all along, and this is over 2 interviews. He decided in the first interview that went 2 to 3 hours that I had had enough. I guess he must have been able to tell that I was there with him, and it was pretty shaking to me. And so then the second interview, and he talks about combat. And the only way I can really talk to him in any genuine, serious, and honest way is to try to put myself in the situation that he was in when he was in combat. Otherwise, I'm doing that distancing and disengagement, that disconnection. This is what we see in the news reporting and in the politicians who talk to us about war and about horrible things as if it is just something on the agenda of national priorities to deal with and, you know, kind of matter of fact. And so I guess I'm telling this story to say that empathy became my method for this book. And then I went back and thought, if it's the method for understanding combat, and I survived this empathetic experience, because I think a lot of women fear that we'll be so hurt by what we learn that we won't survive it, then this may be the route out, the route as in the path, out of war. And so I actually just discovered that while I was writing. It wasn't that I set out to write the book in a book on empathy. It came out of the empathetic experience in the interviewing that I did. What I found about masculinity then, and this is being in several different countries while I'm working on this book, is that by creating this category of innocent lives, that we have this category of human beings who can be killed in war, who I then in this book call expendable lives. And they're men. And it begins with male socialization. Now, I know that there is a huge variation in masculinity within our culture, across all cultures, in our different classes, in different sexual orientations. Masculinity can be very, very different. But when we look at it, I'm a sociologist, when we look at it from the standpoint of society, there's not a lot of variation of what is expected of men. And what it comes down to is getting them in a position of being expendable. The protector role serves that function. It automatically makes men traditionally, hopefully more in the past than in the present, automatically makes men the head of the family. Automatically then makes men the ones who should be there and up and ready to go when their state or their community or their family or anybody around them are threatened. They're the ones we rely on. I like to tell this story to let you know how human foibles can work into writing this book. a couple months ago, I live in a condo, and I live in the top floor of a building, and I have a neighbor from hell who below me. And he was out on his deck screaming up to mine. Screaming, you know, sometimes it's people scream and you can just turn around and walk away and say, just get me out of that bad energy, as we say in California. But this was that kind of fierce screaming that really frightened me, really deeply. I hadn't been frightened like that in years. And he was yelling threats to me. So the first thing I did, I called my brother. I'm writing about the male protector role and how we have to break out of that and how it leads to men's expendability for war. And when push came to shove, and my brother's in Tucson, it wasn't like he could jump in the car and drive over and really, you know, take care of me, but I needed at that moment, and I'm thinking, and I'm doing it, I'm dialing, not dialing, we don't do that anymore. I'm punching in the numbers and thinking, what are you doing? Oh, but I've got to talk to him. So at any rate, that is very deep in us as women, the expectation that you as men are our protectors. It's very deep in men. And men have handled that in varieties of ways. Some have rejected the roles, some have modified the roles, some of them have taken them on wholeheartedly. But underneath that role is the understanding that men's lives can be sacrificed in a way that women's lives are not sacrificed. Women are expendable in other ways in a very sexually violent society, but in this way, no. This is, and except for the women, of course, who enlist and take on the male paradigm of war. This expendability of men's lives serves military training. It puts young men and boys in place for the military to take that, their expendability and push it all the way to what we call the soldier's sacrifice. In other words, you can be killed in fighting for us. Even when you don't need to be fighting for us, we must always add regarding these latest wars. What we have then is, in this expendability, in this core, what I'm calling a kind of core masculinity, we have the military stepping in with its goal of pushing this further, right to the edge of human existence, and training young people to kill without remorse. It was shocking to me, because this isn't particularly my field, wasn't before I started this book, my field of work, to see how systematically the military trains soldiers, women and men, but this is a male paradigm, and it's meant for men. Officially, women are not in combat, although many have seen combat. Many who are there have seen combat. That very thing that I talked about in the beginning, that very urge to save human life, has to be doused. It has to be put out. That human interconnection has to be shifted. You can't break human beings out of our interconnectedness with each other, no matter how extreme the individualism is. We still talk to each other, we still connect with each other. The more individualistic we get, then the computers take over and start connecting us with each other. So human interconnection you cannot take away from us, but you can shape it. Again, that's the function of socialization. And boy, does the military know how to shape that. Talk to almost any soldier who has been in the U.S. military, especially every soldier who has been in combat, and they will say that they are there to protect their buddies. Now, this is very noble. It seems to be very noble. It seems like this stands for something, a very strong human value. But it's a calculated military strategy. For the soldier is also supposed to be wiping out his own identity, not knowing himself as he was before he comes in, submitting to the military authority, and then being able to turn around and kill without remorse. It was found, and the statistics are in the book, they're not in my head, that in World War II, there was the number, proportion of soldiers who actually fired their guns was very, very low. The military saw that as a problem. We got to get more soldiers to fire more guns. It increased significantly by the Korean War. By the Vietnam War, with the war against Vietnam, it was up to in the 80% of soldiers who fired their guns. And now it's pretty impossible to get through a war zone without having fired your gun. At whom? At the enemy, of course. And who is the enemy? The people who are not your buddies. That's how the buddy system works in the military. The people who are not your buddies, who you are there to cover for your buddy, to make sure your buddy is safe. And luckily for you, your buddy is there to cover for you. But you are not to think for yourself at the same time. You've put that identity aside. Let me check on the time. Just a few more minutes. So this is what soldiers take with them into combat. This remorselessness about killing. Kill, 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 kill is a beautiful thing, the Marines chant, before they even leave the country. They chant it over and over and over again. And if I had recorded it, I'd have many and worse chants to convey to you. Some of the soldiers coming back from Iraq have told us, incredible, what I think are incredible stories about their training and the kinds of things that they are engaged in by the military to get them psyched up for killing and to get them to know that the people in front of them are enemies unless they are their buddies. There is no distinction between civilian and those engaged in hostilities, which is the Geneva Convention language for it, in American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is no distinction. The slightest suspicion. One soldier talked about seeing a woman carrying a bag across a field. Woman carrying a bag could be an IED, improvised electronic device in the military jargon. It also could have been a bag of groceries. Don't take any chances. Wipe her out. That's daily. Many of you, or some of you, have seen the WikiLeaks video from the killings from the helicopter that were so shocking to us, where the soldiers in the helicopter saw men coming out of a building and they had something slung over their shoulders, which if you look at the video is very clearly briefcases or computer cases. But up there in the helicopter they thought it could be an M16. And so just in case it is, you wipe them out. And then a car pulls in and a man with 2 children, babies in the car, is going to try to rescue, in that urge to protect and save human life, going to try to rescue one of the men who's still alive. And so they riddle the car with bullets and bring the man who's still alive down. Ethan McCord, a soldier, came up on the scene with his unit on the ground just when the shooting stopped. He heard the cries of the babies in the car. They were both wounded. One was a toddler and one was a 3-year-old. He heard the cries of the babies in the car, and he went directly to the car. Because, you know, these are soldiers coming into an area that's just seen gunfire. So they're coming in with their guns, cocked and ready, but also checking out the whole scene. He goes over to the car and he finds 2 screaming babies. And the first thing he thought of was his 4-year-old daughter, about the age of the little girl in the car, and his infant son, who he had not yet seen. Empathy engaged just like that. He scooped the babies up, took them to an American vehicle that would take them to the hospital. And he was reprimanded for doing so by his commanding officer. But the children were taken onto the hospital. But it was that engagement of empathy that defied all the military training. It is there to come through. It is part of who we are. Even the US military, the most powerful fighting force in the world, cannot wipe empathy out of us. And so when it engages, it then becomes extremely difficult to pick up your gun and kill another human being, because you've broken from military think. And these are the resistors. These are, for me, the beginning. These men and women, but mostly men, are the beginning for me of remaking masculinity. These are the ones who step back because it starts from the self. The military takes you away from yourself. You're there to protect your buddy. Your self is of no importance or no significance. If it's of no myself is of no significance, then how much less significance would your self be to me? You see how that works. And so I think that it's important for us to look to the resistors, the Iraq Veterans Against the War, over in Oakland, Courage to Resist, the campaign to save Bradley Manning. What else but empathy could have been going through that young man's mind? To see what he saw and knew what he knew about what was going on in war, and to then allegedly, let's say for legal purposes, devise a plan to download all of these military documents and provide them to WikiLeaks. Why would he sacrifice himself in that way if he didn't care so much about stopping what the US is doing in killing around the world? Remaking Men has a really positive notion, side to it, because men are doing that themselves. Edmund Rutsch is here from a project on empathy, who has a goal of getting 1 million people engaged in a campaign for empathy. The title of your campaign is?
1 million people to build a culture of empathy and compassion.
And he's a man. Remaking Men. My theme again, I keep coming back to that. I usually, at this point, am talking about demilitarization instead of remaking men. So I'm going to end with a demilitarization instead and say that when I was writing the book, as I got into the middle of the book, I thought, no, the US military cannot be reformed. It is too corrupt, not just in terms of fraud. It has corrupted human life so deeply that it has to be replaced with something else. So I began thinking about it, I began talking with people about it, and I began thinking about what a global peacemaking force would look like, which took me to Costa Rica. Because Costa Rica is a demilitarized state without any backing from the US. Most Americans, because Nicholas Kristof likes to say this in his columns, bane of my existence, that Costa Rica is backed by the United States. It isn't. In fact, the only violation of Costa Rica's demilitarization since 1948 was by the US, for those of you who remember Oliver North, the Sandinistas, the Contras, when we insisted, the US insisted on setting up a military base in otherwise demilitarized Costa Rica. So I thought, what a good place to go and see how this works. And it works. There has been no military since this very bloody coup in the late 1940s that killed thousands of Costa Ricans. And unlike any of our presidents, when a war has taken place, the president of Costa Rica said, "We will never have another coup like this again. Not because we will become the strongest military in the world or the strongest military in Central America, but because we will have no military." This makes sense. And back to where I began earlier, thinking about this long-range plan, this positing out to a future that we're going to define. Let's think about what a world of demilitarized states would look like. And so I think about that in the book, and if I started talking about it, it would go into the next speaker's time, and you would be getting very tired. But I will end by saying that as we're achieving demilitarization, it will not work if we are not remaking men, and that through empathy. Costa Rica has one of the highest rates of violence against women in the world. Not because it is Latin American, not because we know that violence against women crosses every national, cultural, state, economic, whatever category. But because the restraints have not been put on men. Because, well, Costa Rica was determined to not have another war. It was not at that time determined to unmake what men do to women, the criminal things that men do to women. Costa Rica right now has some of the best laws in the world on violence against women, thanks to Oscar Arias, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, who very well deserved that, and thanks to a very active feminist movement. But implementing it in a relatively poor country is the other story, and there's a lot of people working on that. That shocked me, actually. I was kind of hoping that I was going to find that there was, with demilitarization, there was going to be a decrease in violence against women and crime generally, and that isn't the case. And there's other reasons, poverty among them. At any rate, that was the lesson for me in writing this book, that we can think about demilitarizing all states. We can think about putting a global peacemaking force in place to maintain that demilitarization. And we can think about remaking men, because all of them are happening. All of them are already on the way. We just need the 60% of Americans who are now against the war to step up and move for it. So let me ask you for your questions or comments and see if we can have some discussion about some of these things. Yeah.
10 years ago, when George W. Bush first started the war in Iraq, virtually every day on the news, you were told how many casualties, American casualties there were.
Right.
And the number went up and up, and it was always there. It was always in your mind, and you were shocked by it. And all of a sudden it was over 100, and then it was over 200, and it kept right on going. They don't do that anymore. They don't tell you what the casualties are anymore. Why?
Obama has put a lid on that. Obama, the military runs the country with the CEOs. Obama more as a service to them. But he has put a big lid on releasing information. I used to be able to go into the YouTube and pick up soldiers' videos that they would put up on YouTube from combat. They'd come out of combat, they would have recorded what was going on and put it up on YouTube. That's now forbidden. And so things that I had, information I had access to. And the other thing we might add to this is while we were getting the reports of the soldiers in combat who were being killed, we were not getting reports of the Iraqis being killed.
Just Americans.
Just Americans, because, well, the title of my first chapter is The Value of Human Life. So I go into it in there. And the value of human life for Americans is defined by our nationalism. Yeah.
I had recently read Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars.
Yes.
And my impression was that he went, when he was elected president and when he was campaigning, he was, I think, much more oriented towards getting us out of these wars. And then, according to Woodward's book, it just seemed like he was gradually more and more co-opted, to the point where now it seems like he's got completely, because I remember right after he was elected, when the planes would come home with the caskets and the soldiers, and no photographers were allowed, he eliminated that restraint.
Right.
But that book, Woodward's book, is really an eye-opener.
It is an eye-opener. I've read it also, and there's some revelations in there about the military's control over him. I think for me what this has shown is I was a very strong supporter of Obama. I bought the line. I needed hope after Bush. And you know, African American, I was in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, an African American president. You know, I really hoped for a lot there. With Bush, we saw that somebody who was very aggressively engaged in wanting to make war happen. I mean, he was planning on going into Iraq before 9/11. So we don't see how much power the generals and the CEOs have in that decision-making process, because he was servicing them very, very well. A friend, I was down in Santa Cruz the other day talking on this book, and Bettina Ethiker reminded me, Obama did say that he was going to stay in Afghanistan during that campaign. And I do think that I did try not to hear that because everything else was so good, you know. I don't know about him personally, whether this is opportunism or simply merely facing the reality that of the control by the generals and the CEOs of this country. But with Bush out of office and with somebody who appeared to be a pretty decent human being going into office, that has become really very evident and very frightening. Yes?
Since the coup in Honduras, Costa Rica has allowed the U.S. to open a very large military base there. School of the Americas Watch and other groups are very concerned about it. What happened in Costa Rica that they changed?
I don't know. I really don't know that history. I was there for a short time,
Yeah.
and it was really hard to get to the people I wanted to talk to about it. My guess is that CIA, as with every country that we've gotten control of in Latin and South America. But I don't know the specific history.
I know they're
have
doing it
to
in
admit.
Colombia, but I think it's apparently Costa Rica is so strategic to Honduras that they want a presence there. But I'm just wondering how the government of Costa Rica changed to allow that back in.
I don't actually know. Do you know what the presence actually is? Because I was there just a year ago.
It's since the Honduran coup last year.
Oh.
It's within the last few months. And it's Navy and Army, but I'm told it's very large.
Yeah, because it wasn't there when I was there a year ago. So thank you for bringing that up, and it's something that I will look into, because if I'll need to put that on board with the rest of the things I'm working on. Yes?
I often wonder when I watch the news about all the things that Americans are concerned about. And I often wonder about the dimension of our collective guilt that we feel about people dying for us, you know. I think that is there in our society, but it's never tapped into or talked about.
Yeah.
But it's right in there with foreclosures and the economy. It's there, it's like floating there, you know.
How could we not have collective guilt?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, this thing about shared human consciousness is very real, and it goes negative as well as positive. And how could we not, in the absence of actually stopping the U.S. from doing what it's doing, that's what we're left with. This war has brought horrendous things to our own society. The increase in violence, the increase in just nastiness of people, and these are negative emotions that are really getting tapped. Those who don't feel it either have successfully distanced themselves. I have numbers of friends, to my great frustration, and I'm sure that I'm even more frustrating to them, who tell me that they don't watch the news because it's such a downer. And there's something about, I didn't bring it with me, I took out a news report off the net the other day. I don't even remember which, CNN, somebody, it was just a list of casualties of the last few days. And I read it to this class in Santa Cruz the other day, and then asked them to compare the reaction to that to our reaction as a people to the massacre in Tucson a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
If we could go that extra step beyond, nationalism is really powerful in this country, and it's a real shutdown for empathy. You know, you can have empathy only as far as the people are like you. And when they stop being like you, they're in another country, another culture, another language, another religion, wear different kinds of clothes, the empathy shuts down because they could possibly be enemies. And so that's one of our struggles, is breaking through that nationalism. This is one of the reasons I really love Code Pink. One of the many hundreds of reasons I really love Code Pink and like to participate in their actions when I can, is because they're all over. They're in Bangladesh, they've gone into Palestine to set up playgrounds for children. They're all over the world. They don't function within a kind of traditional anti-war establishment kind of structure, which is to be against the war, to be against what the United States is doing, and when we get the United States out, then we quit. They're all over the place. And in fact, there was a talk recently, I'm here in Marin some months ago, where Code Pink was being criticized for for being all over the place, and I took the microphone. That is true feminism. That's feminism without borders, which is that interconnection that we have with all human beings. Yes?
You've described a highly idealized utopia, it seems to me. And it would be wonderful, obviously, as many utopias would be. But there are Hitlers
Yes.
in the world. Should the United States not have a military?
Wonderful question, and one that I really had to struggle with in this book. So my utopian, I'd like to say vision, but my utopian idea or image is global demilitarization. If you can do it, there's several states that are demilitarized. That could spread, okay. But that's exactly the question that haunted me. What about another Hitler? What about another George Bush? What about another, warmongering, people-hating human being coming to the fore? These are psychopaths. I've got a whole chapter on Bush as a psychopath. These are psychopaths, they are remorseless people, and they're not going to get to remorse at any point. We have to be prepared to step in where ethnic cleansing or genocide is about to happen, or the stirrings of it are starting to come up. And so, along with a proposal for global demilitarization, I have a proposal for a global peacemaking force or military, which one interviewer rightly said to me, "Isn't that an oxymoron?" And I said, "Yeah, but let's live with it for now, because we got to start thinking of possibilities." And this would be the idea of this military. And I gave a talk at the Friends House in Santa Rosa, the Quakers in Santa Rosa, about a month ago, and somebody there actually presented me with a proposal, not a proposal, but an actual peacemaking military that's been organized. I haven't had a chance to investigate it yet and to get into looking at it, but that too is in process. My idea, and these are ideas for all of us to take up and take apart and work on and throw things out and put things together, but just to get us to thinking beyond the limits of where we are today. My idea is a restructured United Nations in the lines that Albert Einstein called for after the Second World War, that would make the Security Council subordinate to the General Assembly, not superior to the General Assembly, so that the Security Council, and that one vote that the United States always has and uses to enable wars, that one vote would not be the defining factor, but that the General Assembly would be representing all the nations, all the states of the world, and would be elected, not appointed. So it could be a democratic body. And through that body, or under the aegis of that body, would be a global peacemaking force that would draw proportionately from every world region. I firmly believe that there are human beings out there, men and women, who want to serve their country, who signed up and enlisted with the U.S. military from a very positive spirit of serving, only to find that something else was expected of them. And so I would want to pull upon that instinct for service that gives us firefighters, for example, and people who supposed to keep our communities safe. Drawing upon that proportionately from all around the world, So you would have a very colorful force that would not, there would be no us-them within that force. And that would be a force that could be engaged when diplomacy has failed in trying to control a Hitler or a Bush or another vicious dictator. That's the, as you said, kind of wild utopian vision. But I hasten to add, all these things are in progress. There's a group called the World Federation. They've developed they actually have a global parliament ready to put in place, and they've developed a constitution for the Federation of the Earth. I think they're very good, but I don't get involved in anything that isn't, it doesn't have a strong feminist consciousness attached to it. So these things are in motion, however idealistic they may seem. And I think we need some idealism. I think we need to believe and to reclaim the hope that Obama was provoking and encouraging in us, because boy, mine got really dashed. One more question? Edwin.
Yes, what I've been interested in doing is working on how do we actually build a culture of empathy so that we start actually organizing around empathy and raise empathy to be like a national or international value within the culture. So do you have some thoughts about
Yes.
what do we do to kind of build a culture of empathy?
Well, actually, I can't speak, in the couple minutes we have left, I can't speak to the whole culture. So I'm going to stay with my subject of Unmaking War, Remaking Men. I was giving this talk recently, and there were some men in the audience saying, yeah, okay, I get it, empathy, but then what? And it was interesting to me, because as a woman, it's like empathy ignites me into action. But I think our genders are so differently socialized. And I got home and the questions really stuck with me. So I went down to the Peace and Justice Center in Santa Rosa. We got a great Peace and Justice Center there. And said, I want to do a workshop called Unmaking War Now, from empathy to action. And so I'm going to start offering 4-hour workshops that go through the very phenomena that we did in this talk today of locating in our interactions, because that's my biggest answer to your question. The empathy is right there in our interactions. Locating our empathy in our everyday interactions. Tell me what happened, tell me and give me an example of something where you went from just interacting into empathy, and talking about that, and then bringing consciousness. Feminists are really big on consciousness raising years ago, and we are getting back to that again. Bringing consciousness into that, and then from that, coming up with plans of action, which will be anywhere from writing letters and making phone calls to officials, to joining in demonstrations, to forming your own small group and going off and taking off on any issue. There's no pre-programmed thing to do with it. It's grassroots. And grassroots is where this is going to happen. But I think we have to remember that empathy is implicit in all of our interactions. It will be hard to bring out with sociopaths and psychopaths, because the absence of empathy is part of what makes a sociopath. But other than that, in all of our interactions, empathy is always implicitly there. And it only takes us going a step further. Simple things like, I see what you mean. Or that happened to me too, I know how you feel. And then the connection deepens. And when the connection deepens, there's more commitment building to each other. And as that's building, there's more that we can do with it. I'm delighted. I am.
I'm Joe Romano.
No.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.